This week we were both stunned and outraged by the beheading of the journalist James Foley. In the midst of that great sorrow, there was a nice little nugget there. He said that after he was taken hostage, he started to pray the rosary. He did that because he often saw his mother and his grandmother pray the rosary. It kind of just gives us a little bit of hope for those whose family members drift away from the church, that the things we try to pass on to them do really stick. And when crisis moments come, they have something to reach for, something to hold on to, something to pull them through. And the president also gave a statement, and it really caught my eye, some of the things he said. And he said, quote, "So ISIL speaks for no religion." That's the group that beheaded James Foley. "Their victims are overwhelmingly Muslim, and no faith teaches people to massacre innocents. No just God would stand for what they did yesterday and for what they do every single day." Now that's a theological statement if I ever heard one. No just God would stand for what they did. Well, that assumes that you know that God is just. Whether or not he knew it or intended it, the president was speaking from a very Judeo-Christian theological viewpoint. In other words, he is seeing religion from the viewpoint of the God of the Bible. We would say that our theology leads us to an understanding of a God who is just. And a God who is just is therefore reasonable, and therefore violence has no part in him. The president really put his finger on the crux of the problem. The problem is not political, it is theological. What causes someone in the name of God to perpetrate such awful violence? What causes someone in the name of God to force someone to either convert or to die? That's why this gospel today is so important. It's the central question of the gospel. Who do you say that I am? And it's not just an academic or rhetorical question, but it's the one that gets to the very core of who God is. It's the question, when we answer it, that will determine how we organize our lives, how we organize our societies, how we treat other people. And every person throughout history who comes in contact with Jesus of Nazareth has to answer the question one way or the other. You cannot sidestep the question. Peter, of course, answered the question correctly, but from the rebuke that he'll get a few verses later in this gospel, it's clear that he doesn't get the full implications of what he was saying. But Jesus certainly does, because he tells them, tell no one about this. Because he knew that if the authorities learned that people were seeing Jesus as the Messiah, trouble and hostility would follow. But all of this gets to the question of who is God, how do we understand God, what is our conception of God? And Christian theology helps us to have a very clear understanding of who God is. The God of the Bible is revealed from the very start as the God of reason. In the book of Genesis, we hear when God spoke his word, the creation was formed. And that word, or logos, as it's called in Greek, is the essence of reason. We know that our thoughts are connected to our minds. And when our minds are confused, our words often make no sense. Some seriously mentally ill people often make no sense when they speak because their reason is distorted. We even have crimes of passion when a legitimate legal defense is that our passions, anger, rage, jealousy, so overwhelmed our reason that we're not fully culpable for our actions. And so we see from the start that God is a God of reason. And that makes the world an orderly place, one that we can understand, one that we can begin to get the order of the universe, how it's made, how it works. And then in the New Testament, the Gospel of John starts out by telling us that this word became flesh. Again, it's identifying the God of the universe with reason, which means that we can appeal to reason when we discuss our search for God. That means what is unreasonable is out of step with God's own nature. But what sometimes happens in religions is that God's will is stressed over and above God's reason. We see it popping up all throughout the history of religions and through the history of Christianity as well. So, for instance, if God wills the destruction of innocence, it's good. Or if God wills adultery, then it would be okay. Or even if God willed idolatry, it would be virtuous. But it isn't, since God did not will it so. So whatever then is God's will is okay, it is permitted. And this, of course, oftentimes flies in the face of reason. Because if what we determine to be God's will contradicts reason, then we have a problem. For instance, violence is unreasonable. So if God wills it, God would have to be unreasonable. Pope Benedict, in his famous Regensburg address, tried to address this problem, and he was very unfairly criticized. When he was saying the idea of a holy war is a contradiction, it's irrational. If you place will so far above reason, then it is hard to appeal to reason when you try to critique reason, religious extremism. And this has been the source, we know, of a lot of mischief over the centuries, because it opens the door for divinely sanctioned violence, which is exactly what we're seeing now. But Pope Emeritus Benedict put his finger on the very problem that we face today, the very cause of why James Foley was beheaded. And so much violence is spreading throughout the Middle East, and so many terrorist attacks have happened in the West. It's not because of poverty, it's not because of a lack of education, it's not because of Western imperialism. At its root, the cause why James Foley was beheaded, the explanation of so much terrorism in the name of religion, the spread of ISIS, is a theological problem. It's funny because people today say theology doesn't really matter. But we're learning a hard lesson. If your theology is screwed up, if it's off balance, if it's out of whack, if it's not in sync with reason, you're going to have a problem. And that problem can spread, that problem can infect and affect a society and the entire world. So once religion puts a hyper stress on God's will, it supplants reason, and anything then can be justified, even violence, even coercive conversion. Christians throughout the centuries have done some terrible things as well. And they've done it because they've allowed their theological practices to allow God's will to be the justification for all sorts of unreasonable behaviors and horrible treatments of people. And looking back, we can see that their religious expression was at times irrational and at odds with our conception of God. And I think that's exactly what frustrates us so much today. I think it frustrates the president very much, that our appeals to reason have not made the situation any better. Again, that's why this gospel is so critical. If Jesus is Son of God, Lord, if he is also the Word made flesh, then the way we behave, the way we treat one another has to be in line with that. And the New Testament, of course, takes it a step further because it tells us God is love. And so how can a God who is reason and love make it a part of his will to justify violence and hatred? He simply can't. The violence we've witnessed shows us that something is out of step with who we are and who God is in the religious practice of its practitioners. You know, at our very core as humans is our spirituality, the things we believe in, the things that give meaning to life. Religious freedom, religious liberty corresponds to what is absolutely deepest within us. It's our deepest spiritual aspirations. And that can never be coerced. Sure, you can use violence to force someone to convert, but it's really not a conversion. Therefore, to invade this inner space with violence is to invade humanity at the most fundamental level. We're correct at being so offended, so outraged to see our fellow Christians being told, convert or die. If God is a God of reason, then we must use argumentation, dialogue, and not violence to win people over. And I think that's why we find terrorism so repulsive. It tramples the very core of what it means to be a human person. It also distorts the very idea of the God of the Bible. Jesus' revelation at Caesarea Philippi brings to the fore the God who is both logos and love. And the answer to the question that Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? That answer to that question will define the future of humanity, whether our civilization will last or not. If Jesus is Lord, or as C.S. Lewis often said, he is a liar or if he's a lunatic, that has tremendous implications for the way we live our lives as individuals and the way we structure our societies. But if he is Lord, then looking at the state of our world, we have a lot of work to do.